Hi class, as you begin Module 4, you're going to notice that we're covering two chapters in this module. We're looking at both gender and sexual orientation. The first chapter addresses gender and the problem sex is a major sorting device. And even how we define sex related to the issues that come into place, those gender issues, are defined as social constructs. You know, sex is biological, but gender is that social construct that comes into place. And so we face multiple issues as we start looking at the problems that occur related to gender. So let's pop over to So the reason, as we quickly review this, that gender is a social problem that exists out there is again based in the inequalities that come into place based on gender. Sex, as I said before, is physical. It's that physiological difference between men and women. It's biological. Very interesting as we explore this. The more we know about gender, about sex, we find more differences, but let's just consider for this point that there's a true definition difference between men and women. Gender is different as it's determined by our society and our culture. It sets the rules by which we perform, gives us those stereotypes. It's taught and reinforced through family, schools, and peer groups. And the problems that arise here are such things as sexism and prejudice, or the discrimination based on that occur based on one's sex or gender. Pretty powerful as we think about this. Now remember, when we think about this, oftentimes we think this is strictly a women's issue. And there are reasons that we talk about feminism in this chapter. However, we can never study the issues of gender and just focus on one gender. We need to expand that, because the minute we fail to look at the issues of masculinity and femininity at the same time, we neglect the population. So pretty important as we look at what goes on here. So from the functionalist perspective, we're looking at here, gender inequality is a necessary function of society. From the functionalist viewpoint, that we need to have that variation coming into place. And I've told you long before that this is holding structure into place. Functionalists, few sociologists would consider themselves functionalists, but it helps us to view that world, that this gender division of labor is needed and essential and part of the stability of society. In other words, having a woman do a lesser job and getting paid less for what is their work is pretty significant in supporting the economy. And then we put that role of breadwinner on men in that process. From the feminist perspective and the conflict perspective, and again, as you start looking at these together, women remain in subordinate positions. In fact, Karl Marx, who you know is basically the father of conflict theory, here he is writing with John Ingalls, and John Ingalls states that the worst place for a woman to be is in marriage, because at the time period he's writing, everything she owned becomes her husband, and she is under his subordinate. She is subordinate to him, and it becomes that domineering position. So we see the conflicts theorists identify women's subordinate position in the same role of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat that we've talked about before, that the power means that it affects their relationship and it also affects them in society. For feminists, they really look at gender as the major issue coming into place that maintains this gender distinct and inequalities into place, and it guides the whole process. From the interactionist point of view, social values and meanings are expressed in our language, and our language reflects the privilege of a position granted to men, that it comes into place. From the interactionist perspective, we can see that it defines by norms and values and the beliefs how women are different, treated different as young ages as girls than boys, and what comes into role and the reinforced role of socialization that comes in as we start to explore it. So what are the issues and what are the social problems here? Well, significant issues in occupational sex segregation. And we find that women's jobs oftentimes require more education. However, they pay significantly less, and that these jobs that they lead into are pretty specific. Job consequences, the consequences of the gender inequality in the fact that women earn less than men. Now remember, you're going to watch a video here, which is important for you to look at, of why women earn less than men. It's not that they're always paid less, but there's less opportunities for them to end up in those higher positions, or they choose careers that pay less, that tend to be gender specific, and it's pretty substantial. So this separation of women into non-manual labor and men into manual labor really affects the job earnings of women, and it reinforces the stereotype of where they fit. And so we see this major income inequality that comes into place. Now, remember, inequality is tied to our status, and that human capital theory, the skill that a worker requires through education and work experience, tie into that. And what has happened is that it devalues work, especially that work of women, so that we see that it reduces their status in the workplace, and it also reduces their income. Educational attainment is significant. Women rank higher than men as high school graduates. They complete more bachelor's levels of college, and right now more women are equal in earning master's degree, though men have more masters as we look at the total population. And yet we still have this gender gap into place. So some real important things as we respond to this gender gap inequalities was the feminist movement that began in the 19th century. And so for us in the area here, we well know the rights that occurred, the feminist movement at beginning with the first women's convention held in Seneca Falls. We only have to drive up the Finger Lakes to be there to see the home of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, where she and Lucretia Mott set together the Declaration of Sentiment. And now remember, this particular movement is tied to the civil rights movement that we talked about and reviewed in the last chapter. And we can see that this feminist movement then moves along as well. Now, men, African American men, were given the right to vote after the Civil War. It was not until the 19th Amendment in 1920 that women were given the right to vote in the United States. Now, remember, certain states allowed women to vote, but at a federal level, they couldn't. We see the second wave of feminism that has come along in the 1960s, again tied to the civil rights movement, pretty powerful as we look at that. And the passage of Title IX for educational amendments that come into place and try to make things more equal within the educational world, as far as women's sports and other things. And as you're well aware, Title IX is part of your directive, even on your syllabi. I would recommend you even go back and read the Title IX provisions today as we are entering the third wave movement of feminism, as we look at the protection of rights and the move currently in the news as far as the treatment of women, which has been extremely strong in the dialogue this year, even becoming the person of the year as a movement of looking at the treatment of people equitably. Now, feminism talks about equal treatment. Radical feminism is the violent feminist out there, but feminism really talks about equality. And as you review the information in this chapter, and you'll start out with a quick video on what the reality of gender pay is, and then the story of Lilly Ledbetter. Lilly Ledbetter was paid unequally for years and how it affects her family and the law that followed related to it. She lost her hearing. Interestingly enough, the Supreme Court found against her because she had not filed that she was receiving unequal pay within the first so many months of it occurring, when she did not find out about it till 20 years later. And then a quick clip on gender from Michael Kimmel. Now, Michael Kimmel is a sociologist, a feminist sociologist out of California. He's written a number of books, especially related to gender of men. So he gives you an interesting perspective as you start to look at this. In the second chapter, it deals with sexual orientation, and you can see how these chapters, these 3 chapters, 3, 4, and 5, come together to look at inequality. And you'll see it again when we look at the prejudice and discrimination that occurs to other people, such as aging and the disabled. But these are really tied together here. And so as you examine these series, you'll look at that at a deeper level. I'm asking you here in this particular section to look at just the information on gay marriage in the United States. And we know that the federal law has said that gay marriage is legal in all states, but not all states recognize that. There's still some conflict within that as we look at issues. And then following that, just a review of the issues of hate crimes and rights within areas related to gay rights. So, as we examine sexuality, we really look at the terms of sexual orientation. And it's a classification of individuals according to their preference for emotional sexual relationships and lifestyles. So we look at mainly homosexuality and heterosexuality. Now, there are many different levels well beyond this. And so there are issues of bisexual, transsexual. We look at the LGBTQ community as a group, but they're very different within that process. And we also have within this sexual perspective, asexual. This particular area is so in-depth. We offer the course of sex and gender every other fall, which goes into it at a much deeper level than we're touching on here. But based on a survey in the U.S., about 2.8% of males and 1.4% of females think of themselves as homosexual or bisexual. And about 5% of males say they have had sex with someone of the same gender after they turned 18. So we have some idea that this is a small percentage of the population. So why is it a social problem? It doesn't all necessarily fit in that classification of affecting a numerous people as we look at that breakup of what is a social problem. The reason this is a social problem is because this population has pushed through social movements, and our society says it's a social problem. That gay rights have a place in society. Now, gay rights have progressed in the United States and globally. National polls indicate increased support, and we well know that by even knowing that the findings came for same-sex marriage to be approved at a federal level. So significant issues, as we explore this under our theories again, we look at this as far as understanding what sexual orientation is. Well, research across the disciplines on homosexuality, where biology looks at the possibility of hormonal or genetic base, we now know more about people who are born with multiple sex backgrounds. And in the past, I might have even shown you a video on how many people are born with a mixed piece in their body. We call them Aphrodites, but in reality, there are significant pieces that we're understanding more than ever before. Psychology originally classified homosexuality as a mental illness, and it now studies it, and it more based on its homosexual identity and what comes into place, where sociology examines this from the social structural factors that affect sexual orientation. So in the fundamentalist perspective, fundamentalists identify how this society holds heterosexual as the normative, that men and women are ideal and normative and into place. Now remember, that is the stability of the society when we look at the functionalist perspective, and that there are these set ideas of what relationships are and defined on who we are as we look at that. And so people will examine the issues and come to the such as the Law for the Defense of Marriage Act, which denies federal recognition of those same-sex unions. From the conflict perspective and feminist perspective, we see the heterosexual assume that heterosexuality is normative, discouraging discrimination in the favor of heterosexuals against homosexuals. And so we see the power and the status coming into play in that situation. In the interactionist perspective, we see the formation of ideas, thoughts, the individual's ideas such as homophobia. We see the context of how we construct this, and we can see the construction and how it falls into the roles that people play. So the sexual orientation of a social construction is timed and bound and culturally specific, and the developed of the gay identity also is determined by the supports and the reactions of others. We can go back to the looking glass theory of Cooley, and we can see that we define ourselves based on the society and how it comes into place, or how our parents have looked at us or our friends. So what are the issues here? The right of couples, for same-sex couples, the rights that come into place, and you will examine that. And we can see other things, employment issues. Between 16 and 46% of gay and lesbians have reported discrimination based on sexual orientation. You can see that power coming into place after we've just looked at gender and how many women report that as well. The issues of Civil Rights Act as far as coming into the discrimination, that they're not covered under the Civil Rights Act for discrimination, though there have been additions to add them to that process. And so we see multiple things. Issues related to military service. So first, don't ask, don't tell. And then the openness that came under that it was available. Now we're looking at a current administration that is saying denying health care for certain issues to this population. This is an ever-moving issue as far as the social problems that are tied to that. So as you come back to finish the second chapter here, I've asked you to give a quick look at the list of states and the same-sex union issues that people face, and just a history that has come into place regarding the process. You'll notice when you click here, this is a presentation from the History Channel, and just the history of the movements that come into place, the homophilia, the years, the rights, the fight for gay rights, and the tie to the civil rights movement, the Stonewall riots that occurred in New York City, the move towards the victories and the fear of homosexuality through the outbreak of AIDS. So I do ask you to explore that at a deeper level. Finally, as always, you can move forward to participate in the discussion board. Remember, you need to answer the questions fully in the discussion board and comment on at least 3 other members of the class. Your first initial entry is always due by Wednesday, and the finals close on Sunday evening. Have a great day.